Because the honorable member also has that, and he's not in the room.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. Thank you very much. Mr. Speaker.
Well, maybe you may want to do it now because the honorable Luke Brown has returned.
Yes. Mr. Speaker, thank you very much. You will recall that I was accused of stating that the medical facility at Georgetown is unnecessary. Mr. Speaker, I will read what I believe to be a true recording of what was said on the middle paragraph on the second page. Those are the things I am talking about, why we are squandering money which we don't have. I started very deliberately by saying it's a wonderful facility and a necessary facility. Unfortunately, it is costing us so much more unnecessarily. Mr. Speaker, this is the point. And health is not something we should be playing politics with. Mr. Speaker, there is nothing in what I said there that even remotely suggests that I am saying the facility is unnecessary. It points to the unnecessary additional cost because of the wrong placement of the facility. Lucidly clear. And I leave the matter for your adjudication, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have really no appetite for a protracted exchange, honourable member for West Kingston. In as much as he has raised the matter by reference to Hansard, I'd just like to indicate a few things which I saw in Hansard myself. It's my view, based on what I've read, and this is the Hansard, he said that there's a need for the facility. He said that it is useful and effective, and he ultimately said that it is unnecessary. And there's several reasons why he said it's unnecessary. He said it's unnecessary because it is duplication of services. He said it's unnecessary because it is not a good use of limited resources. He said it's unnecessary because we have incurred additional costing which need not be incurred. And he also said it is unnecessary because we only require one main medical facility for mainland St. Vincent. And Mr. Speaker, on top of that, I'd like to reiterate by taking this point, you would recall likely that yesterday in the evening, honourable member said that he did not suggest that the services provided at the Modern Medical and Diagnostic Center should be added to the services at the Milton Cato Memorial Hospital. That also, Mr. Speaker, I take it on the basis of the Hansard to be incorrect. Mr. Speaker, in the Hansard, he's quoted as saying, and to use his word lucidly, clearly, that one main medical facility is quite adequate to serve mainland St. Vincent. In what he just said, I noticed that he did not mention this part of the Hansard. Mr. Speaker, he went on at his capture here to say that we should have taken an approach similar to the approach taken in relation to the addition of solid waste services to the Central Water and Sewer Authority. The clear indication being that we should have added the services at the Modern Medical and Diagnostic Center to the services of the Milton Cato Memorial Hospital. And these are his precise words in that connection. After going through the background, I just crave your indulgence, Mr. Speaker, to quote a paragraph from his statement. Mr. Speaker, let me put it as simple as I can. There is something called economy of scale, as demonstrated by St. Vincent and the Grenadines having the most cost-effective management system in the OECS, consequent upon the decision to incorporate in the already established Water and Sewage Authority. Decision to incorporate the solid waste into the already established Water and Sewage Authority, so that in establishing a solid waste management unit, there was no necessity to hire an additional financial controller, an additional public relations manager, human resources manager, etc., etc. This is one of the reasons why today St. Vincent continues to have the most effectively run solid waste management in the whole of the OECS because of the benefits of linking it to a well-established entity. And he didn't want to leave anything to our imagination or in doubt. He brings the thing home by saying this. And I use that simply to explain how we could have benefited from incorporating these services as part of our main hospital. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Well, you can respond if you want, but here's my take. Here's my take. Clearly, based on the introductory points that the Honorable Parliamentary Representative of Kingstown made, he was clearly pointing to what he perceived to be a very good facility. He said it was necessary, he said it was wonderful.
No, don't use words like
He said it was necessary, it was useful, and he spoke to the necessity, the usefulness, and the effectiveness. And then he goes on to speak about the importance of a national medical facility. And then he talks about the issues of economy of scale in a very small society like ours. And then he said that he gave an example of the way in which the solid waste center was dealt with. I can understand clearly the point which the Honorable Minister of Health takes. I think that based on when the Honorable Parliamentary Representative of West Kingstown pulls it all together and says that this could have been at the Kingstown Medical Hospital, the inference he can properly draw from that is that the medical facility at Georgetown could have, all of the services there could have been included in the Kingstown Medical Hospital. And the consequence of that is that it was not necessary for a hospital at Georgetown. So I think the two positions are equally, two contending positions are equally valid, that the Honorable Minister, the Honorable Parliamentary Representative is saying that this facility is necessary and useful and is effective and recommends it. But then on the other hand, I can clearly see how the Minister of Health could take those same words and come to the conclusion that the Honorable Parliamentary Representative of West Kingstown is saying that it is not necessary to have it. I really don't think it's something that we should be detained on. I think we should proceed. Honorable Member, proceed.
Mr. Speaker, if you'll permit me, you can only come to such conclusion if you're not party to a whole series of reports that have asked this government to relocate Milton Cato from Kingstown. And if you're not aware of our many public pronouncements on the necessity for a proper modern medical facility in St. Vincent.
Honorable Member.
And it isn't that, if you're not aware of that, then you'll come to that conclusion.
We can only discuss what is in the public domain. What is in the public domain is the presentation you made and the presentation which the Honorable Minister of Health was responding to. And I don't think there's any need for us to continue this conversation any further. I think that you have been pellucid in presenting your point, and I think that the Honorable Minister of Health has been equally pellucid in presenting his point. So I want to suggest that we proceed.
Again, I thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, honorable members, I rise to make my contribution to the budget debate of 2019, coming as it does, as is the custom of this incompetent government, to bring it long after the time when it should have been done. Our budget is supposed to be done at the end of the year to start in January, and having it outside of that period is reserved for emergencies and other occasions.
Hold 1 second, please. Is your submission that the budget debate coming at this time unconstitutional?
Mr. Speaker, I am not a lawyer, and I don't speak in legal terms. I never infer that.
I am not talking about law. I'm talking. You're a parliamentary representative in this parliament. You're a parliamentary representative in this parliament. Yeah. You should be affair with the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And if you are saying something, if you are saying what you just said, which clearly does not comport with what the Constitution says, then I don't think you should be allowed to say it. But I did recognize the honorable. He was rising when you said what you said, but so I would let him
Mr.
speak
Speaker,
to the point.
I don't think there's any need for me to add to your observation.
Very well.
Thank you.
No, I will proceed.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I'm saying, Mr. Speaker, administratively, it is important that the budget be presented on time. That's all I'm saying.
But you're
administratively.
But don't double down on the point when the point is wrong. You can't double down on the point.
What is wrong, Mr. Speaker?
Because I recall, honorable member, yes. I recall in the estimates, you said that we should even move it from December and put it like about September, October. Those were your suggestions then.
Not in the estimate.
Not in the estimate, well, in a session before that. But those are your words.
Yes.
So, if the Constitution allows for the budget to come as it is coming, why are you prefacing your presentation to this Parliament in the way in which you are doing?
It's an exception that has restriction.
You want me to answer, Mr. Speaker? Mr. Speaker, as I said, if it is an inconvenience to the government to have the budget at the end of the year, there is the possibility, like any good business will do, to make adjustment to the end of the fiscal year. If you prefer to do it in September or June or whatever. But for the last several years, it has never been the practice of previous governments to have it coming over into January with such frequency. That's all
what are you standing on?
That's all I'm pointing to.
Mr. Speaker, I wouldn't want the honourable member to leave this honourable House or the general public with the impression that the government is acting in some way against what is contemplated by the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, since we're using the word so frequently today, is pellucid. We can, according to the Constitution, lay the estimates before this honourable House by the end of the month of January. We did that. It then goes on to say that we have an additional 3 months to have the debate on the appropriations bill. We are having the debate on the appropriations bill at the beginning of February, well within the 3 months contemplated by the Constitution of St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The honourable member may have a view that the Constitution is incorrect, that the Constitution should be revised, whatever he thinks. But I wouldn't want anyone to leave, Mr. Speaker, thinking that this government is doing something untoward or outside the bounds of the Constitution as contemplated by the founding fathers of this country. I'm obliged.
Yes, please.
Now, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, let me begin by looking globally at the budget and to reflect on the inability of the government to spend as it has budgeted over the years because of lack of resources. And to recall the finance minister's fears with respect to programs like the Citizens by Investment program, while at the same time saying nothing of existing program which should have more fares. Mr. Speaker, Petro-Caribe was supposed to allow us to get cheap oil. Over the years of the operation of that program, we, the people of this country, have paid the full price of the fuel imported into this country for the production of energy. The tariff, the surcharge has been high. We paid every cent. What the government has done is to take the money and pay back only a portion and sustain a very high debt to this country. CIP affords the government two things: investment in the country and revenue without taxation, not loans. Free money that can be used for projects, that can be used to create employment and so on. I want to know which is more risky. Look at what has happened to Petro-Caribe. Look at what other OECS countries have benefited from by the Citizens by Investment program. Mr. Speaker, I want to look at several portfolios in the short time that I have. Permit me first to carry on from here to look at geothermal energy. Mr. Speaker, we on this side of the House have long recognized the importance of geothermal energy. In fact, the very first study was done under Jeremiah Scott as Minister of Works. The site was identified. Mr. Speaker, I turn to the Finance Minister's comment in his budget address on page 28, which speaks of the geothermal project. 28, and I quote from the last paragraph of the page. Our geothermal energy project promises to revolutionize the delivery of electricity to the Vincentian people. It will provide stable, predictable energy pricing to businesses and investors, increase our energy security, save foreign exchange, and dramatically reduce our carbon footprint. Totally agreed, Mr. Speaker. Totally agreed. The one thing, however, it doesn't say is that as a people, we will be paying less for electricity. And the reason why he can't say it, Mr. Speaker, is because of the power purchase agreement, which is reported to have been agreed upon between the people who put their money into the project and the government, which remains secretive up to today, so that when they're gone, we would have to deal with the price of electricity as pig in bag, as the people say. So much for talk. Yet I heard the minister seated next to the Minister of Finance talking about low electricity prices because of the geothermal plant. I wish he would listen to the Minister of Finance. I wish he would listen to him. Mr. Speaker, the terms of that contract, the expensive drilling, no cheaper than it is anywhere else. We have some of the geology that makes it difficult to drill, and it's very deep drilling. But it's the way the project is financed that people outside of St. Vincent have been allowed to invest their money in the risk-taking components of the project and have certain assurances. The only way people put money under those conditions is if they have assurances of a rate of return that is suitable to them, which is usually quite high. And therein lies the dilemma where we could lose the benefits, the key benefits of geothermal by having reduced energy costs. You see, Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Minister of Finance, I want to look at his budget address when he spoke about establishing a pension committee to deal with a matter, Mr. Speaker, which all of us will agree is a very serious matter. But what I find interesting is that the pension committee has established comprised only of public servants. Only of public servants. It makes no reference to expertise outside of the government and private sector and in the particular field. And I wish to suggest to the Honourable Minister that be given some consideration. You see, Mr. Speaker, matters like these are not supposed to be mired in politics. We really need to get the best advice to deal with a very difficult matter. And I'm simply suggesting to the Honourable Minister that we look at broadening that committee to possibly including relevant people from the private sector and insurances and so forth. Mr. Speaker, on page 50 of the Finance Minister's address, 50, dealing with implementation, I find the penultimate paragraph on page 50 to be of extreme interest, and I read it, Mr. Speaker. For upcoming projects, we will attempt a number of new approaches to improve the speed with which projects are completed. Some critical small projects will be packaged to make them more attractive to large regional contractors. We will be more resolute about documenting contractor non-performance to our development partners and the tenders board. We'll upgrade our ability to comply quickly with the strict social safeguard demanded by certain development partners. Mr. Speaker, when I read this, after having listened to it, it reminds me of the ruling of the High Court recently relative to the Public Service Commission. If you are telling me that after all these years, the government is now looking at ensuring that the tenders board has information on how contractors are performing, no wonder we find repeat offenders. People getting contracts, can't perform, and just absconding. You're now looking at ensuring resolute about documenting contract and non-performance to our development partners and tenders board? Isn't that a critical and essential component of project monitoring and evaluation? How can the tenders board make proper decisions if they're not aware of contractors' performance? After almost 18 years? Mr. Speaker, Braxa, page 30, 30. Mr. Speaker, Braxa has been mandated with a very serious responsibility. The need to maintain roads in this country has never been as high as it is today. Admittedly, a lot of it due to the increased traffic flow, but admittedly, a lot of it due to inefficiency. Even though there's an increase of $4 million in the allocation in the budget for BRAXA, this does not necessarily mean that BRAXA will get even what was budgeted last year from past experience. But even more telling, Mr. Speaker, and I wish to draw this to the Minister of Finance's attention in conjunction with that of the Minister of Transport and Works. It is amazing to me, not even as an engineer, but as a layperson, to see how much road repairs are attempted in this country in the height of the rainy season. It's like throwing money down the drain. You know, try to ensure that BRAXA will get some funds so that it can maximize the dry season to perform work. I have seen it so many times that you come and fill holes, and before you can say Jack Robinson, according to the Trinidadians, it's washed out. These are the things that, as a people with limited resources, we must learn to use our best methods. This is not rocket science. It's not rocket science. Mr. Speaker, I want to turn to the capital estimates. In particular, and I'll be backward and forward. On page 694 of the capital estimates, Mr. Speaker, we have the port project in Kingstown, 694. Mr. Speaker, I want the people of Rose Place in particular to understand, as I've said in this Honorable House before, Mr. Speaker, to understand that there are several partners financing this project. But there's a component of this project which is critical to its success, and it has to do with the relocation of people in some parts of the project area. None of the financing partners will provide any money for that component of the work. That money has to come from St. Vincent and the Grenadines. And so when I see on page 694 a provision for $4.5 million in 2019 for out of a project amount of about $11.5 million coming from local source. Mr. Speaker, I said it before. If you want to have an indication of whether a project, a capital project, is going to result in any movement, see if it comes from grant money or from CDB or one of the reputable financing agencies or for some already approved loan. But when you see it, it's categorized under local or other, 9 times out of 10, it ain't happening. And I just want the people of Rose Place to be aware that this government has got to provide that $11.5 million mainly for the necessary work. And I know that agencies like the Caribbean Development Bank and so forth will make these requirements as conditions precedent to disbursement. That is to say, if the government doesn't put the money where its mouth is and get these things done, the project ain't going no way. I say that without any fear of contradiction. Mr. Speaker, I have been making a plea repeatedly to this government for the construction of a bypass road in the constituency of West Kingstown before, during, and after the construction of the South Leeward Rehabilitation Project. Mr. Speaker, you know, on page 472 of this document, 472, I see something, if it weren't so ridiculous, I would have laughed. Here's how, after all these years, here's what the ministry can tell the people of West Kingstown about that road. Under the strategic priorities to 2018, it says preliminary work on the Camden Park, Otley Hall, Kingstown bypass. And here's what they did. Conducted a basic site investigation to determine possible routes from Lowman's Bay to Otley Hall to link with Edinburgh. Mr. Speaker, they didn't have to do that. They could have called me. They didn't have to do that. But they took a whole year, Mr. Speaker, to do that. And there's absolutely nothing in the budget to say they're going to start design or they're going to do something. In other words, nothing happening on that project. Nothing. Mr. Speaker, the Honorable Minister of Education told us that they're going to do some work on the Stony Ground. Call it the Kingstown Government School, the Stony Ground School, primary school. Mr. Speaker, in this Honorable House, I have been appealing to successive ministers of education to end the trauma inflicted on the students and teachers in that school, occasioned by the blocking out of the front of the road by 3 abandoned shops. I only hope, Mr. Speaker, that if this project comes to fruition, the entire site compound will be cleared and the children will have a safe environment in which to play. Similarly, Mr. Speaker, I see the Stony Ground School on page 60 with the provision for a temporary structure. Mr. Speaker, I am happy, and I thank the Honourable Minister for indicating to me where it's likely to go. The only problem I have with it, Mr. Speaker, it comes under local funding. And I don't want to say anything more. Local funding is saying it never happened. Good. Good. Mr. Speaker, Fort Charlotte, page 702. You know, since the Honorable René Batiste was parliamentary representative for this area, we've been having promises about that bridge leading up to Fort Charlotte. We were told that we had French people coming to do design. We have page 704, you know, Mr. Speaker, when you look, when we say that this document is a joke, people may think we are being dramatic. Mr. Speaker, these things keep popping up in the documents year after year after year, with not even an attempt to say something that would shed some reasonable light and give an explanation as to what is possible. Why grandstand and say you're going to do that bridge and you have money allocated when you know it ain't gonna happen? But you keep doing it not for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, more than that number of years. Why fool the people of this country? People have a legitimate expectation in reading this document and that there will be some level of truth in it. And Mr. Speaker, you have cleared the way for the government to understand what reasonable expectation is. The budget document is not to be a joke. It ought to be a serious document. But who can take this as a serious document? Not even the Minister of Transport and Works. Because any time you ask him about a project, the first thing he's going to tell you, no money there. But on the same breath, they will tear apart the Citizens by Investment program that saw the people of Dominica got storm-resistant housing out of CIF. You hear what I say, Mr. Speaker? We like to talk about the environment. We like to talk glibly about preparing ourselves for it. Yes, we like to talk. But there's a project funded by the World Bank and others, consequent upon the damages we've had over the years, which charges government for doing certain restorative works. Among them, they have included what we on this side have been begging for forever: the lining of the channels in the North and South River. We've been begging for it. But lo and behold, Mr. Speaker, against the advice of the experts, including the consultant on the project, they've gone ahead and spinning top in mud in the North and South River, in particular, using gabion baskets in the bottom and the short sides as a means of protecting the river course. I don't know what they're protecting, because, Mr. Speaker, what is even more troubling, I asked the minister if there's any hydraulic analysis or hydrologic analysis done in the design, and he assured me it was. You're going into the river and digging it up and putting down gabion baskets, Mr. Speaker. But what you're doing, you're not doing the entire channel. You're doing limited number of sections. Don't we understand that when you show up at one area, you create weakness in other areas? You don't have to be an engineer to understand that. If you're going to line the river, do the whole river. Otherwise, you will simply undermine in a short space of time what you have just done. This is money that should be put to good use. When I speak like this, you know, Mr. Speaker, there's a certain minister on the other side who tells me I know everything. Apparently he thinks he's the one who knows everything because he doesn't listen. You speak for everybody. But, Mr. Speaker, very seriously, I urge this government to take on board the advice of the consultants and put this money to good use. Let the rivers be properly lined. Use the prime estate in Kingstown with a properly lined channel to develop a number of other projects above ground by simply constructing the river banks and concrete in the bottom. If I repeat a simple area in Stony Ground, the boundary between Central and West Kingston, Mr. Speaker, with a properly lined channel, there is no limitation in what kind of construction can take place in the heart of Kingston, next to Victoria Park. Magnificent facilities for steel pan, for cultural center, for arts and craft. Tremendous facility can be constructed atop the covered drain, but you have to construct the drains properly. But Allah, it falls on deaf ears. Mr. Speaker, anybody who lives on the windward side of the island understands the problem of transportation, getting into Kingston in the morning and getting out in the afternoon. I wonder, when has there been a transportation study in this country? When you look at the area outside of the girls' high school and opposite the construction going on just past the Murray Village Gap, 6 o'clock in the evening, there are still very many school children waiting for transportation. Waiting for transportation. Mr. Speaker, it has long passed the time for a proper transportation study. Mr. Speaker, the destruction of the traffic lights in Kingstown, which were the most modern anywhere in the world, actuated by the traffic rather than fixed intervals, the deliberate destruction of those lights, and the use of traffic people who don't seem to have sufficient training in coordination, who will stop you in one area and then have you flow in a direction where another one has already stopped you. The work that should be expertly done by the magnificent traffic light system that was introduced in this country, we're going backwards. The time has long come for there to be a proper transportation study. I see here in the budget, Mr. Speaker, provision for a study to design opening up the airport road. Mr. Speaker, there's something wrong with this. A study, the ministry is calling for a study to design opening up the airport road. It is Joshua Airport, that is. Opening up that. You need a study to design how you're opening up that, Mr. Speaker. I'm a civil engineer, I'm not a traffic engineer, I'm not a road engineer. I'm not a road engineer. Mr. Speaker, you won't want to hear my thing, sir. Mr. Speaker, this government met a project proposed to do a road that will allow traffic moving from the windward or leeward side of the island not to have to go through Kingstown. The current flow of traffic in Kingstown is mind-boggling. It seems to be the work of people who have zero training in traffic flow. Mr. Speaker, it doesn't require a road engineer to tell the people in charge that the traffic flow in Kingstown is absolutely ridiculous. There are road engineers in the country. You don't have to look outside for that. There are people who specialize in these work. And while we boast about how many vehicles we bring into the country, we don't seem to understand the concomitant responsibility to plan for and design a transport system that will not frustrate people, but rather have them enjoy the luxury of a vehicle. This is common sense. But again, I know this will be scoffed at, because only one set of people. Mr. Speaker, how much time do I have left?
You have time. You have like about 15 minutes.
Mr. Speaker,
you started at about 5:25, but there was a lot of interplay.
Mr. Speaker, I want to turn I want to turn my attention, unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, because it's very painful to do it, to talk about health care, or rather lack of health care in this country. Mr. Speaker, let me do something again which I don't like to do, but I think it's necessary in the context, because I was offering some simple advice about the management of a healthcare facility which seemed to have fallen on deaf ear or totally misunderstood. To put it into context, Mr. Speaker, after having served as a utility manager for 17 years or so, I was invited by a Caribbean country to undertake the establishment of a statutory body in that country in all its facets: the legal, administrative, financial, regulatory components. And I was called because of my training and experience, and in my previous work in the design of the now very useful Act, the revised Act of the Central Water and Sewage Authority. I was also asked, Mr. Speaker, to join a team in proposing to this government a structure for the administration of health care in St. Vincent and the Grenadines outside of the public service, which is well recognized to be the most inappropriate way of dealing with matters like health. Mr. Speaker, this is not to cast aspersion on the public service. There are many very competent people there. But it is set up in a manner that requires a tremendous amount of paperwork and backwards and forward before you get anything done. I know what I'm talking about because when I was asked to manage the CWSA, I met an inherent public service attitude which we had to change completely. I say all of this to say, Mr. Speaker, when I listen to the Honorable Minister of Health come to this Parliament and say he is going to appoint, or government is going to appoint, a CEO for the hospital, and then flippantly say there's going to be a board, and deny the creation of a statutory body, I'm wondering, how did we come to this? Mr. Speaker, could you imagine the person in charge of the administration of the main hospitals being simultaneously responsible for Milton Cato and the hospital in Georgetown? Can we see the logistical nightmare of that? Mr. Speaker, can we begin to envisage a board established to run Milton Cato with a CEO, an administrator, and all the other quirks that go with it, the structure? Can you imagine that, Mr. Speaker? With all the difficulties that exist now, that mechanism proposed by the minister is 100 times worse than what you have now. It cannot and it will not work. And all I was trying to do is to help to point to the need for reform. Yes, totally agree. The need for the reform in the management of health care. There are too many people, Mr. Speaker, who are not accountable. There are too many things that fall off. There's too much hemorrhage in the hospital. There are too many people who are getting services and not paying for it. There are all kinds of things going wrong. When we pay for medicines, Mr. Speaker, too much of it does not end up where it should. When people contribute supplies to the hospital, too much of it doesn't reach the patients. These are realities. And what you need is an effective, with competent people in an environment that encourages performance. You see, Mr. Speaker, because we're dealing with health care, it's not just about the dollar. The need for customer service in the hospital is far more important than it is in the Water and Sewage Authority. It's far more important than a private sector company. When people come to the hospital, in many instances they're traumatized. Someone close to them has gotten ill. You need to have people who can give them a level of assurance and reassurance. Trained counselors, not be told, sit down and wait. People need to have a feel for what they're doing, to be trained, recognized, and properly compensated. Yes, corrected and punished when they don't perform properly, not make scapegoat of. But alas, Mr. Speaker, no wonder this is not going to happen, because I read recently a report purporting to come from the Ministry of Health and the Environment to the effect that at the mental health institution there is no active TB case. In other words, Mr. Speaker, anybody reading that or listening to it would get the impression that there's no need to worry or panic. All is well.